Katsuki was frozen in place on the couch. The text at the bottom of the screen, standing out against the blue line it was written on, seemed to glare at him. A hollow feeling settled in his stomach as he watched the screen blankly. The glowing screen shined brightly against the dark lights of the room. His eyes flicked away from the news reporter to the picture displayed next to her. He already knew who the broadcast was about. That was the only reason he was watching so intensely. The picture shown just proved it that much more. Curly and slightly unruly green hair, wide and shining emerald eyes, and freckled cheeks. In the picture, Katsuki's old childhood friend was grinning and an arm was wrapped around the boy's shoulders. It was obviously cropped to just show the green-haired boy, but that wasn't the thing going through Katsuki's head. The reporter droned on, voice nearly monotone despite the issue she was talking about. Then, Katsuki started seeing posters. The same picture with the name, a phone number to call, and the word missing written in thick, red letters. He watched from across the street, standing near the front of his middle school. He frowned at the sight of his childhood friend's mother frantically showing every passerby the posters with a scared, frantic look on her face. It wasn't his usual scowl, but his other friends didn't even look at him as they waved at him, walking away. They knew that he probably wouldn't glance at them, anyways. Katsuki was kind of glad that they didn't notice anything at that point. Ever since he first saw the news reporting it, he'd been in a state of blankness. Whenever he was at home, he'd shut himself inside his room with a computer, or sit on the couch and watch the news intently. He looked for anything to fill the shallow feeling in his stomach caused by what he denied was worry. His father had tried to get him back to his usual self, and so did his mother. Neither of their attempts worked, but he could see that they were at least trying. At school, he had stopped picking as many fights, but did have the occasional outburst for a sense of normality. The two guys who followed him around probably had noticed his change in behavior, but didn't mention it, probably out of fear for him snapping at them. Katsuki's head was pretty much always in a half-hazy, foggy state. That was probably why he didn't really feel himself stepping off the sidewalk. He jogged across the street and walked up to the woman handing out posters. She looked up at him, face lighting up in recognition and relaxing slightly as she greeted him. The woman continued asking people who were walking by on their way to jobs and other places after Katsuki muttered out a greeting in response. Katsuki stared down at his feet as he leaned against the wall behind him. He glanced up a few times before picking up some more of the posters from where the woman had a stack of more posters. He continued frowning, purposefully looking away from the woman as she looked at him in surprise. He ignored the feeling of her eyes on him as he held out the posters, stepping in front of a businessman a little as he did so. News reporters and studios had stopped mentioning Katsuki's missing friend a while ago, around the time the friend's mother started standing on the corner across the street from the school with a pile of papers. That was probably when it started really affecting the blonde. He had kept thinking about why the case had vanished from the media, or why the effort going into it slowly faded into nothing. The case was just called a lost cause, and no one really knew of the green-haired boy. Somehow, though, they still knew Katsuki. From the story of the sludge monster, and when he was saved by the #1 hero All Might. It wasn't old, but like his old friend, it faded into the background of the media. More modern stories of celebrities and heroes took that place in the limelight. But Katsuki couldn't shake the thoughts that kept haunting him every time he was reminded of that friend. Because the truth was, Midoriya Izuku vanished a month after trying to save Bakugo Katsuki from a sludge monster who was ultimately defeated by All Might. We'll see you tomorrow, Kurogiri said. Don't die or anything, Shigaraki grumbled, glancing up from under his gray hair. Right back at you, Izuku snorted as he opened the door to exit the bar. See you later. Izuku strode through the door and closed it behind him. He pulled the hood of his gray sweater over his head. Doing a quick check that most of his green hair was tucked away and hidden, he strolled out through the alley. He followed his usual route down side streets until he reached the main road. He jammed his hands into his pockets and slouched down a little. After a couple months of being a member of the League of Villains, he learned how to not stand out without overdoing it like others did. As he came to the area near his old middle school, he came to a stop at the corner, and frowned up at the large building. Students were leaving for the day, from after-school clubs and just from hanging around on campus. Parents came by in cars and the students climbed in before driving away. Izuku barely felt any sting about that part anymore. He turned back to facing across the street as the walking sign turned on and the crowd surged forward. The men in business suits and women in pencil skirts all walked around him, each going somewhere determinedly. Izuku simply blended in like he did almost every day now on his way back to the small, cheap, and admittedly dirty apartment he was living in. He kept his eyes forward, but the bright color of ash blonde hair caught his attention. He stopped in his stride, a few feet away from the blonde and his mother. The two were near the corner of a building handing out the missing posters he kept seeing. The ones he normally saw were drenched on telephone poles, in garbage bins, and just lying on the streets. He watched them with a blank face, emerald eyes blinking slowly and watching Katsuki's movements as he stopped people and showed them the posters. His mother did the same, except less forceful and with more stuttering. Katsuki nodded at a man in a suit as he excused himself and he looked around the crowd again. That's when Izuku's eyes met his. Izuku quickly looked back down at his feet and continued walking, red shoes moving quickly across the pavement. He slouched his shoulders and wished his hood to be lower on his head, but didn't want to adjust it at the risk of standing out even more. "Hey!" he heard the familiar voice shout. He knew it was directed at him, but he kept walking. It would be bad if Kacchan actually talked to him, or worse, his mother. Despite being around cold-hearted villains, he wasn't sure if he could flat out deny his mother's requests for him to come home like he was supposed to. Shigaraki had told him that soon, even the cutest or most innocent face wouldn't be able to affect him and his decisions. The gray-haired male always claimed that eventually, Izuku would barely be affected by anything. That not even the most violent or drastic action would make him blink twice. He wasn't sure if it was true, or how exactly it would happen. As he turned the corner down a side street, away from the heart of the city and towards the more bad part of town, he glanced back at Katsuki. The blonde was looking after him, having seemingly lost him in the crowd. They made eye contact one final time before Izuku strode down the other street and was able to shake off the feeling of searching red eyes. Back at the corner, Katsuki frowned. Maybe he was hallucinating. Izuku glanced around at his surroundings. He smirked to himself as he wandered away from the main walkway and its crowd of students and into the trees that surrounded the campus. It was the first day of school at UA, and Izuku was sneaking in with the rest of the crowd. He had sunglasses placed over his eyes and his hair was sprayed with temp dye so it was an off-black. Surprisingly, he hadn't seen Katsuki, but if he knew the blonde, he was already in his classroom and probably picking a fight with a stuck-up student. Izuku smirked to himself as he ducked under some branches and picked his way through bushes. He knew exactly where he was going, having memorized the blueprints the League was able to get through their hacking job. He didn't know who did the hacking, but he was thankful and glad that they did. It made his job a whole lot easier, knowing where to go and when to be there to observe the quirks of the students. As he worked his way through the trees, he easily avoided all of the cameras, staying out of their lines of sight but still making his way to the training field. He glanced around the dirt space, noting the white markings on the ground. He picked one of the taller trees with bright green leaves and jumped up to reach the first branch he could. With a huff, he pulled himself up onto it and sat against the trunk, balancing himself on the branch. Izuku checked the time on his phone before sliding it back in his pocket. He pulled off his gloves, being careful to not scratch himself with the sharp edges on the back. He places the gloves in his pocket and stretched out his legs, cracking his knuckles and lacing them behind his head. He had some time before the students came out and needed to start his job. Luckily, the leader of the league, Sensei, understood that he probably wasn't the best to fight someone hand to hand and placed him on jobs like this. He had a few things to help him if he got in a fight, of course, like the gloves and the steel tips added to his usual red sneakers. Soon after he had joined the league, he was in an entirely new group of people, most far more powerful than Kacchan and probably most of the students. Being quirkless also became a much bigger issue, what with Shigaraki Tamura killing anything he touched with 5 fingers, Kurogiri being nearly invincible to physical attacks, and all the lower-level villains that were members. Izuku guessed that they definitely weren't full-fledged members, or at least ones who helped decide anything, but he still knew from only a few encounters that they'd crush him in a fight without weapons. But that was what the weapons were for, each of them made so that they were not as obvious as other weapons that villains and heroes used. What it all really meant was that he had to make up for lacking a quirk even more. Izuku glanced up through the leaves as he heard the sound of a sliding door. He shifted so he was sitting up straighter and pulled out the small notepad he had on him. He pushed the sunglasses up on top of his head and pulling his pen out. He pressed the button on the small gadget resting on top of his ear. A small bar shot out and a small lens appeared in front of his eyes. He adjusted the settings on the edge of the frame until it zoomed in and focused on the students so he could see all the students clearer. Before he even knocked out the student he stole the uniform he was wearing from, he looked over the class lists that he managed to get. He had pretty much memorized the students' names. He had recognized 3 names, Todoroki Shoto, Iida Tenya, and Kacchan, obviously. The first 2, he only noticed because Sensei had him look into pro heroes to see if he could come up with any way to beat them, even if it was just theories and in the hypothetical sense. He was actually a little surprised at how easy it was to get information like the real names of pro heroes so easily on the internet. Maybe there was something to be learned there, but he found it didn't matter to someone like him, who pretty much vanished off the face of the planet a couple months ago as missing. Spinning the pen on his fingers, he watched blankly as they began, doing a regular physical exam, only using their quirks to the best potential. Strangely, the teacher wasn't really on any of the records the league was able to get, but Izuku knew the name from his pro-hero research, and his face from a few years of constant hero worship. Aizawa Shota, Eraserhead. He'd be a bigger problem than any of the students, and the other teachers besides All Might. He felt that much was obvious, but still wrote a scribble of a note down so he'd remember. Izuku didn't really pay attention to what the teacher was saying after the initial explanation, but spent the first few minutes matching names to faces from the files he read and marking their names down on his notepad. Once the quirk tests began, he was immediately writing like he used to all the time before the sludge attack. He frowned the memory mid-word and glanced up at the training again. He clamped a hand over his mouth to muffle a yelp as a baseball zoomed by his head, barely missing him through the leaves. His pulse pounded in his ears in the surprise for a little longer before he let out a silent sigh and relaxed again against the tree bark. By the time he looked back up, the student who had thrown the ball had stepped away and the next person was stepping up. Izuku blinked a few times at the student waiting with a new baseball in his hands. White and red hair was perfectly split down the middle, the colors perfectly separated. A red scar marked his left eye. Izuku heard himself muttering and bit his bottom lip to stop the flow of words. He shook his head as the student drew his arm back and threw. He didn't bother paying attention to how he used his quirk, just what it was. He scribbled down his notes under the right name. Todoroki Shoto, heard Kachan refer to him as half and half. Son of Endeavor, Todoroki Enji, quirk. Ice control plus, probably something else. Likely not immune to temp changes, could see ice on skin. Good control, likely dangerous in battle 8/10x. As Class 1A walked back into the building, Izuku slid his notepad back in his pocket, clicked the gadget behind his ear off and putting the pen back. He didn't really bother watching the students retreat into the building. He noticed Katsuki acting a little more mellow than he remembered. Then again, his oldest childhood friend vanished soon after saving him from a monster. Izuku could see how that would be easily surprising. As he sneaked his way back to the main gates, he had half a thought to stay on campus until the end of the day to avoid anything else. He shook his head at the idea as he reached the edge of the trees near the main path. If Izuku was thinking honestly, he couldn't care less about what happened to the random student he had picked out on the street. He placed the shades back over his eyes, ran a hand through his hair and checked his fingers for black dye. After seeing the black spotting, he nodded to himself again. He jumped out from the bushes and ran across the clearing to the gates and outside, off the campus. He didn't remove his glasses or take off the uniform jacket he was starting to hate. It was sweaty, and while that was probably the fault of its actual owner, it still annoyed Izuku that he could feel it clinging to his skin. He kept walking casually, and people only glanced at him, saw the uniform, and then turned away without really registering it. Once he reached the alley he had dumped the unconscious student, Izuku practically ripped the jacket off as he swept down the alley. He walked down the dark, grimy alley and ducked under an almost arch made by a fallen piece of sheet metal and old, never-used dumpster. His sunglasses were dropped to the ground and he distastefully ran his hands through his hair again, looking at the cheap dye staining his fingers. He glared down at the student tied up on the ground with duct tape over his mouth. "How do you deal with this horrible uniform?" Izuku spat distastefully. "It's annoying." Izuku tossed the uniform jacket onto the dirty ground and quickly changed back into his original clothes, a black sweater and old jeans. He left the UA uniform in a messy pile on the dirty ground and dug through the bag he had left there with the student. The student stared at him with wide eyes filled with fear. Izuku frowned at him as he took out the syringe and vial of green liquid he prepared himself. He sat down and calmly filled the syringe with the green liquid, and disinfected the needle with a piece of cloth. The student's eyes kept glancing back and forth between Izuku's face and the sharp needle. "Relax," Izuku sighed, rolling his eyes. "It's just something to put you to sleep before I untie you. I can't have you attacking me, you understand, right?" The student just looked slightly scared again and started trembling. Izuku pouted again and shifted forward, wiping a spot on the student's neck with the cloth so it was clean. The student twitched away and stared at Izuku in fright. "Do you want to get an infection?" Izuku asked sourly. "I'm just making sure you don't die from anything. The least you could do is be willing and not try to run away." Izuku felt the student relax for just a second and he quickly jammed the needle on the spot he cleaned and injected the contents quickly. The student tensed up again and let out a frightened, but muffled noise of fear. Izuku hummed slightly before he finished with the syringe and yanked it out. The student's eyes immediately started drooping as Izuku ripped open a band-aid and placed it over the spot where he inserted the liquid and sticking it down. He patted it and leaned back, smiling in fake happiness at the student as he passed out. The green-haired teen smirked and started untying the student. He left the duct tape on, not wanting to wake the student up again, even if only a little bit. He started packing his bag again, putting the syringe, vial, and cloth in a small box and sliding that into the leather bag. He got to his feet and stretched out his arms. Grabbing the bag, he slung the strap over his shoulder and double-checked the bag. He glanced down at the student again, and decided to kick the uniform slightly closer to the student. He picked up his sunglasses, sliding them on his head, balanced on his forehead. He slid his pen in his pants pocket and took off the small gadget, dropping it in his bag with his other gear. The league probably wasn't expecting him back until much later, so he decided to go out and wander a bit. He strolled back out of the alleyway, ducking down through the arch again, and back out onto the street. Glancing around, Izuku began strolling down the sidewalk again, nodding his head along to imaginary music as he made his way to the dirtier end of the city. He followed his usual route to the shopping area. Katsuki watched with his usual scowl as the pro hero 13, who was serving as a guest teacher in the class's visit to USJ. He glanced around at the large dome building and narrowed his eyes. Ever since the quirk assessment, he felt like someone was watching the class. He initially dismissed it as the same paranoia that made him think he saw Deku on the street that first day. Now, though, he was getting the same feeling, stronger than the other times he felt over the past days. The other students were hyper but still listening intently to what 13 had to say. A few weren't as impressed by the speech, but Katsuki only really noticed that Todoroki was glancing at him and looking around the building with similar caution. He didn't know enough about the other, who he'd nicknamed Half and Half, but he recognized that the other seemed to feel like something was observing them, too. It was probably a good thing, a sign that he wasn't completely crazy. Katsuki had tried to mention it to one of the other students he found tolerable, Kirishima, but the redhead just said he was probably nervous since he was in a dangerous environment. The blonde knew that wasn't right, or denied it. Katsuki was about to give up on his paranoia when he finally saw something. A black-purple swirl of darkness near the fountain in the center of the USJ building. He glanced at Todoroki, who was looking at the fountain, too. Their teachers noticed it soon after him and the other, and then soon the rest of the class. They all watched, murmurs and shouts of fear spreading in the small crowd of students. Katsuki grit his teeth, slight satisfaction flashing in his mind at the prospect that he was right. He immediately mentally shook that thought off and watched as the swirl grew. Then, people started walking out of the swirl. Two yellow eye shapes appeared on the dark smoky swirl as what Katsuki guessed were the last people walked out. The smoke pulled back a bit, until it was a sort of moderate size. He immediately looked at the other two standing next to the smoke, who he was guess was probably a person. Without realizing it, he was tuning out the voices of the teachers and students. His eyes widened a bit at the green hair he spotted on one of the two near the smoke man. A mask covered the bottom half of the person's face, but their face was tilted up, looking right at the students with shining green eyes. Katsuki couldn't ignore the pang of recognition in his mind. He really tried to, though. "There's no way," echoed in his mind over and over. He vaguely heard the person was a villain in the back of his mind that was paying attention to what was happening around him. He tried to look at the other villains, but he couldn't get the feeling to stop and kept looking back at the green-haired villain. He thought of other things that could stop his suspicion. He was a hero nerd, so no, but then again. Katsuki's hand sparked small explosions as he grit his teeth even harder at the thought that it might be who he thought it was. To the other students, the explosions passed off as him wanting to fight, but he wasn't even listening as Kirishima tried to calm him down. He kept his eyes on the green-haired villain as they turned away slightly, seeming to talk to the gray-haired one next to him. The smoke shifted again, moving over the green-haired villain before going back into its previous position. Katsuki's breath hitched as he stared where the other had been. A warp quirk, he heard someone else say. He immediately looked around for the green-haired villain, or a flicker of purple-black smoke to signal where they'd appear. Todoroki was looking around, too, having the same idea that they might appear and attack near them. Their teacher, Aizawa, jumped down the stairs, goggles over his eyes and scarves ready to attack. Katsuki barely registered anything as he looked for the green, curly hair. He heard 13 telling them all to get to the door and evacuate. Smoke appeared between the students and the door, though, cutting off Ida's running. As the warp quirk villain materialized, the green-haired one stepped out of the smoke. They had their hands in their pockets, eyes scanning over the students as the smoke one talked. Katsuki knew that the speech the other was making was supposed to make him scared, but instead it made him more angry. even if he was barely making sense of the words. He clenched his fists and felt Kirishima doing the same next to him. 13 said something back, but him and the redhead were jumping forward. He didn't know why exactly, but he was really pissed and wanted to punch something. It was probably the fact that the itching feeling wouldn't leave him, and the more he looked at the green-haired villain, the more dots connected. What better to punch than a villain? An explosion blasted out of his palm, aimed right between the two villains in a wide right swing. Kirishima was right behind him, swinging for the warp villain specifically. To Katsuki's surprise, both moved out of the way with ease. The smoke villain seemed to sigh as his smoke body moved back into place. Katsuki turned his head to look at the green-haired one, only to be met with a solid kick to his face. He was thrown back with the force, and faintly recognized that the shoe was probably steel-toed, just from the feeling. Kirishima was thrown back, too, by the smoke villain. Katsuki opened his eyes again, rubbing his jaw where he was kicked. The green-haired villain's bright eyes stared at him almost bored as he slowly lowered his foot from where it still was in the air. Katsuki stared into those eyes intently, trying to make out anything in the familiar eyes. The green-haired villain adjusted the black gloves he had on and tilted his head up to look at the warp villain. "Told you," he said, before turning his face back to the students and raising an eyebrow. "Right swing every time." Katsuki stiffened, instantly recognizing the voice. He shook off the hand that was pulling him back and jumped to his feet. He scowled again and stared at the green-haired villain. The students were all whispering and mumbling things as the sounds of Eraserhead fighting with the other villains seemed to echo distantly in Katsuki's ears as he stared at the other. He barely heard 13 saying something to him, just sounds without any real definition to the words. He felt his legs take a few steps forward, and the green-haired villain tilted his head to the side again like he was asking Katsuki to say something. "Izuku," he whispered, but multiple hands grabbed onto his arms and pulled him back into the crowd of students. Immediately, he started struggling against the hold, shouting incoherently. He noticed Todoroki staring at him in confusion, and most of the others not holding him back doing the same. 13 stepped in front of the students, the small cap on one of their fingers opening up and the vortex beginning to draw the villains in. He stared in horror as the green-haired one slid along the ground a little, being dragged forward with just the force, and the smoke one started shifting back, trying to resist the pull. Katsuki could care less about them. He was more worried that who was probably his childhood friend could die a few feet away from him. Then, another smoke portal appeared in front of 13 and one behind them, the vortex following through and thoroughly destroying the pro-hero's back. 13 stumbled on their feet before collapsing. A few students went and helped support them. "Scatter them," the green-haired villain ordered, pointing a finger at the students. "But leave Bakugo Katsuki and Todoroki Shoto, Iida Tenya, too. Aka Explosion Boy, Red and White, and Ingenium Jr." "Right," the smoke villain said. The students all tensed up a little bit and glanced at the three referenced. Next thing they knew, the dark smoke washed over the group, forming a giant dome of moving darkness. Students shouted to each other as the wind started swirling with the smoke. Katsuki held an arm over his eyes, and squinted against the dust that was kicked up. His eyes ended up closed as his feet slid back along the cement a little. He couldn't believe it. It was impossible, right? There's no way Midoriya Izuku was a villain. Almost every day Katsuki could remember, Izuku fawned over heroes. He had kept notebooks of hero research. Even if the other did have a change of heart, he was quirkless. What use could he be to a villain organization? The smoke started to clear and the blonde looked around frantically. Almost every student was gone, leaving Katsuki, Todoroki, Iida, and a few other students near the side of the platform holding the injured 13. Katsuki turned back to face the villains with his usual scowl. Todoroki glanced around in shock before turning to glare at the villains. The green-haired villain scoffed and looked over at the students who had escaped his teammates' range. 13 isn't fully out of action, the green-haired villain mumbled, looking up at the smoke villain from the corner of his eye. And Uraraka Ochako is still here, her anti-gravity powers would send you sky high. Katsuki paused for a second to think about how he knew the name and quirk, but quickly dismissed it as the itching feeling of being watched. He clenched his fists again. "Deku," he shouted. The green-haired villain looked up in surprise. "That's who you are, right?" The green-haired villain looked up to his teammate and shrugged. He pressed a button on an armband and a shockwave went out. The ground cracked and Iida collapsed to his knees, electricity going up the metal parts of his legs and shot pain up his spine. Todoroki and Katsuki both stumbled a little at the force. Todoroki glanced at the other in concern, and felt something wrap around his right ankle. He looked back up at the villains, following the wire that was snug around his leg to the same band on the green-haired boy's arm. The other pressed another button and ice shot along the string. Ice hit Todoroki's skin, creeping over his hero costume. He heated up his skin and melted the ice and wire off subconsciously, also through the leg of his costume by extent. The green-haired villain immediately pulled a notebook out of his jacket and started writing things down with a pen that seemed to come out of nowhere. Katsuki instantly recognized the slightly charred composition notebook from when he blew it up and threw it out a window. He felt a pang of guilt at the memory, wondering for a second if he was what made his old friend fall into villainy. Katsuki shook it off and ran forward, right fist swinging back. "Why the hell won't you answer me?" he shouted loudly. The green-haired villain just ducked out of the way like he could tell exactly where the other was going to end up. The notebook and pen vanished back into the dark coat. Katsuki glared at the other with a scowl but found himself getting hit again. A knee slammed into his stomach and completely stopped his momentum. He dryly looked up at the other in surprise. The green-haired villain swung his leg up again, hitting Katsuki in the chin. He set off an explosion, swinging for the other's head, only to have the other duck down. A gloved hand pressed to his stomach, right where he had just been hit. Another shockwave went off, the direct contact causing Katsuki's head to spin as he stumbled backwards. He grit his teeth and reached his hands out, setting off a flurry of explosions. The attacks stopped for a second and Katsuki got proper footing back. He noticed that the smoke villain wasn't next to the other, but he only dismissed it as one less fighter. Behind him, Todoroki was watching the fight analytically. When the smoke cleared, the green-haired villain's mask was now covered his entire face. His arms were up, the bands on his arms taking the blunt of it. The lull of the silence only lasted for a few seconds, and the villain was moving again, arm swinging back. His forearm flashed with electricity and it all swelled at his fingertips and palm. Todoroki ran forward, stopping a little behind Katsuki. Ice shot out from where his left foot hit the ground, shooting out and catching the green-haired villain off guard. The energy that had built up was slammed into the wall of ice instead of his intended target of the blonde. The villain yelped loudly as the blast also knocked him back, rolling in backwards somersaults along the cement until he skidded to a stop on his back, legs flopping to the ground limply. Katsuki let out a sigh in relief, glancing up at the other student who was regarding him blankly. He scowled again and turned back to face the green-haired villain. "Thanks," he grumbled, standing up straight despite the pain in his stomach. "Do you know him?" Todoroki asked after nodding to the other's comment. "I think so," Katsuki said, eyes narrowing as the green-haired boy sat up and climbed to his feet. "But it's really only the hair and eyes." "Green hair does seem unique," Todoroki muttered. He turned to face where the villain was dusting himself off. The ice wall he had put up, obliterated by the energy it had stopped. "What's his name if he is who you think he is?" "Midoriya Izuku," Katsuki hissed, memories of the days after Izuku's disappearance flashing in his head. "But you shouted, Deku," the other pointed out. "Old nickname," the blonde answered simply. "That notebook belonged to him too." "If you know all that, then why are you second-guessing it?" Todoroki asked, holding his hand out at the ready to launch another wave of ice. "He's supposed to be quirkless." The two students stared across the empty space at the villain as he shook rocks and dust out of his green hair. Todoroki glanced at Katsuki out of the corner of his eye, concerned. Old connections might just make the battle harder to handle. Katsuki stubbornly shook his head and clenched his fists, setting off small test explosions. Izuku frowned under his mask as he picked through his hair, getting rid of the dirt. He looked back up at the students. Kurogiri was handling 13 and the other students. Ingenium Jr. lumped in as he tried to figure out what was wrong with his legs. Izuku felt a flicker of pride at his own weapon's effectiveness. But that wasn't the problem now. He started grinning again and flicked one of the switches on his armband. Little bolts of energy flashed between the generators on his arm before solidifying in a blade that stretched over his hand, flashing and twitching in small lightning-like flashes. Todoroki and Katsuki were meeting his expectations, so far. Izuku couldn't stop the eager feeling that washed over him when the fight had really started. He was smiling under the mask as he dodged and ducked out of the way of the explosions and ice. Katsuki's skill level hadn't gone down at all, despite what he probably felt when Izuku disappeared, the quirkless boy noted to himself. Of course, he had almost nothing to base his assessment of Todoroki's skill, but he could easily tell that it was at least equal if not better than Kacchan. His weapons weren't doing the most they actually could do, but that was because Katsuki was a lot better at dodging now, and combined with Todoroki, the attacks were powerful and frequent. He only really had a moment to feel smug that Katsuki had to learn something other than punching, but that had to be expected to some degree. As he started to skid to a stop, A few yards away from the two heroes in training, ice coated the ground and he slipped. He managed to catch himself before he completely fell over with his hands, flicking the energy blades off so he didn't accidentally hurt his hands. Katsuki set off a large explosion, the force sending Izuku sliding back on the ice. The heat that the explosion put out melted it a little, enough so that it was even more slippery. Izuku used it to slide completely off the ice as Todoroki froze it over again. He realized that it was a smart move, likely unintentional, and made a mental note to write it down. Izuku jumped to his feet again and looked back at the two heroes. Katsuki stared him down for a few seconds before rushing forward. Behind him, Izuku noticed the slightly exasperated look on Todoroki's face. Izuku found himself smirking again. The UA school year had barely started, so it was doubtful that the students would get along all that well. Most of them probably barely knew how to act heroic, or how to fight. He instantly excluded Todoroki from that list, unexperienced, considering his family. As Katsuki charged him, shouting something that Izuku didn't care to listen to, the green-haired boy whipped around and ran toward the railing on the side of the platform. He grabbed the bar with his hands and pushed himself upside down, supported in the air. Katsuki paused for half a second, shock crossing his face. Probably from the fact that before the League of Villains, Izuku could barely run a few miles without heaving and collapsing. He felt only a flash of pride at Katsuki's hesitation, but quickly pushed off the railing when he saw Todoroki running forward and preparing to shoot more ice his way. Izuku fell down the side of the platform, flipping in midair quickly to land on his feet. He was right to put small shock absorbers in his sneakers. He pressed his body to the wall that supported the platform he had just jumped off of. He looked back up at the ledge. The two probably couldn't see him in the shadows, even with the green hair. So he waited patiently for the half a minute that it took for Katsuki to shout something notchable. "So what, he's planning an attack?" he heard the blonde say. "We can easily beat him." Izuku frowned at that. He had planned for Katsuki's confident nature, the inferior feeling he made sure that everyone who dared get near him felt. He was starting to prefer the more reserved Todoroki as an opponent. With a sigh, he pulled the grappling hook attached to his hip out and fired it up. The hook looped around the bar easily. After a few seconds of making sure the two either didn't notice it or weren't going to mess with it, he pulled the trigger again. The wire instantly started retracting and he held on tight as he was pulled upwards at double the normal speed the grappling hook should allow. You could do a lot with junkyard scraps, he thought to himself when the pride of his modifications actually succeeding washed over him. He pulled up nearly to peeking over the edge when he stopped it. His hands reached up and grabbed the bar as he left the hook hanging. He had others. Sure enough, Katsuki and Todoroki were shouting at each other. Katsuki completely blocked the other's view of where Izuku was now crouching on the railing, and the blonde was turned around, shouting at Todoroki. Izuku took a moment to relax as he thought of what to do, which would be more fun. He could wait for Katsuki to turn around and shock or kick him in the face, that would be fun. Or he could test out his theory with Katsuki's grenade-shaped gauntlets. Of course, Izuku had watched the battle training before this, and he witnessed as Katsuki pulled the trigger on those gauntlets and the chaos that erupted from it. Izuku decided that he could do both. He carefully lifted his hands off the bar, balancing only on his feet. He waited until Katsuki huffed in annoyance, guard going down just a little. He hopped off the bar and reached around the blonde, grabbing his arm. Katsuki instantly stiffened in shock and tried to pull away, but Izuku had his arm lifted and he pulled the trigger of the gauntlet. Todoroki's eyes widened in shock at the action and then the large explosion that went off. Katsuki was staring in horror as his quirk had accidentally activated on instinct and the massive explosion erupted. Izuku stared in awe at its strength while Katsuki froze up, even if it was just a little bit, when he had no idea what he just did. Todoroki coughed dryly, looking back up as the smoke cleared. He had seen the giant explosion, too, but he hadn't thought it could ever be that much. It was probably built up from both the battle training and the rest of the time he had been wearing it, so the size and severity made sense. His eyes were squinted as the pain that had shot up his body faded away as he iced it with his quirk. He was able to defend himself, so he did get the blunt of the attack, but it still hurt. His bicolored eyes turned to Izuku, standing half behind the shocked and scared Katsuki. The mask had retracted back somewhere along the line so that it only covered the bottom half of his face with the teeth patterns. The bright emerald eyes shined with what could only be described as childish awe. Katsuki snapped back to reality and immediately shook Izuku off his arm and reached for the mask. Izuku dropped to the ground again and swung up with his foot, toes slamming into Katsuki's chin and shaking his skull. Katsuki grit his teeth as he stumbled back, wishing the pulsing in his head to go away. He scowled at Izuku, explosion sparking as he dove after Izuku again. The other easily rolled out of the way and jumped back onto his feet. He swung around and landed another kick on Katsuki, hitting his shoulder and knocking him over. Katsuki collapsed and rubbed his temples angrily, as he waited for the headache to go away. He knew it was stupid to completely stop fighting, somewhere in the back of his aching mind, but he could barely think and really didn't want to mess up. Like letting Deku sneak up on him and fire the weapon directly at Todoroki at nearly point-blank range. Izuku turned back over to Todoroki and glanced around the main platform. Kurogiri was handling the students well. Ingenium Jr. was nowhere to be seen, so Izuku guessed that the other villain had let him run away at some point. He sighed and wandered over to Todoroki, hands swinging lazily by his side. He crouched down next to the other, knowing that he was likely far too injured at that moment to do much. Just to be safe, though, he sent a small shockwave through the other. "You have a fire quirk, too, don't you?" Izuku asked quietly. He watched as Todoroki stiffened instantly and glared hard at the green-haired villain. "But you don't use it. Issues with dear old dad Endeavor?" Todoroki's flinch confirmed that he is egocentric, so I don't blame you if you hate him. But they're your quirks, not his by any means. You should start using it, since it is yours. You don't owe him anything. Todoroki glared up at Izuku, body still aching from the shockwave. He tried to push himself up, but was only able to make it so he was propped up on his elbows before his muscles started to give out. Izuku stood back up, looking over at Kurogiri and started walking back over to them. The ground shook and he whipped around as a loud crash sounded from behind him. He fell backwards onto the ground as the culprit walked forward, out of the cloud of smoke. His eyes widened and he grit his teeth as a small wave of fear washed through him, making his stomach twist. Kurogiri only glanced once at the approaching figure before warping away, leaving Izuku behind, unintentional, he hoped. The students' faces all lit up with relief, some with awe, and others with surprise as the figure emerged from the smoke. Izuku stared openly and muttered, half to himself to help him believe it. All Might. Izuku scrambled to his feet as his breathing got labored. His head was filling up with previously repressed memories. He had needed to hide those feelings, the thoughts in general, when he was recruited by Shigaraki. Villains weren't supposed to actually have feelings on the battlefield, especially ones like the fear and nausea Izuku felt. It blurred his mind, forcing the thoughts to the forefront of his mind, and felt his throat close up a little. He was having trouble breathing as it was all dug up again by the sight of the hero. Days turning into weeks, all of him staying locked in his room. The hollow feeling that wouldn't leave him no matter what he thought. The tattered posters and smashed figurines. His mother dragging him out of the house occasionally, the pang of hatred that he felt when he heard other people his age talk about heroes, going to UA. Concerned looks, offers of nearly anything he wanted from his mother almost every day. Wandering along the dark streets, shadowed from the nighttime, after being forcefully sent out to get something for his mom. Izuku found himself running out towards the stairs, away from All Might as fast as he could go. He could practically feel the pro-hero's eyes on him as he stumbled a few times. He leapt off the ledge at the stairs, skipping many steps at first before walking down 2 steps at a time. A black mist portal appeared in front of him about halfway down the stairs and he jumped through it. He landed with a rollback next to Kurogiri and Shigaraki. The gray-haired villain was mumbled something about All Might being late. He really couldn't care, busy fighting down the bile rising in his throat. "You almost left me," he managed to get out, looking up at Kurogiri. Anything but the pro-hero who was speaking in his loud voice. "Apologies, Deku," the smoke villain said, before turning back to All Might. Shigaraki ordered Numu, and the beast followed without thought. Izuku honestly wasn't sure if it was able to comprehend any thought. Maybe the brain was just for show. He knew what he was thinking was useless, not relevant, not something he should be thinking in the middle of their debut battle. But to be honest, he was glad his brain was able to conjure stuff like that up to distract him. Falling into one of those hollow moments he still had, less frequent, but still there, would be much worse than just losing concentration slightly. Izuku turned his attention to where a pair of students were making their way back to the stairs. The frog girl and grape head, as he heard some of the others refer to him as, were limping slightly, but in good condition otherwise. He could run over there and fix that, but decided if they were injured it'd be fine. Looking back up at the platform, he could see the students gathered at the edge. Nearly all of them looked happy and full of awe as All Might started duking it out with Numu. Katsuki and Todoroki were being supported by some of the other students. The explosive blonde's eyes were staring right at him, glancing to the fight a few times. Izuku doubted that Katsuki didn't know who he was. Kacchan was a lot smarter than he let on. In a more instinctual way than book-smart like people who were considered intelligent. All of that was irrelevant, though. All Might went to slam Numu into the ground, but Kurogiri acted. A portal appeared under Numu, allowing Up to reach up and grab All Might by his abdomen, right where Sensei had supposedly injured him severely. He didn't think that All Might seemed any weaker than usual. But judging by his current position, the pro-hero was genuinely in trouble. No one, no matter how amazing or legendary, would be able to hold up against Numu that well. Izuku was ready to call it, ready to turn around and walk away. Shigaraki's rambling was starting to get annoying, repetitive and pretty meaningless to him at least. Izuku let the coiled-up tension leave his shoulders and jammed his hands into the pockets of his coat. Kurogiri had a lot more patience than him, and was more able to deal with Shigaraki's childish acts when it came to battles. So the smoke villain calmly stayed there, keeping the portals in place as Numu gripped All Might roughly. A flash of motion stopped Izuku. He was getting tired of sudden interruptions like this, saviors popping up at the last seconds. It was annoying. He frowned and glared back at the fight. He only felt a fraction of surprise, turning his head up to glare at the students again. Todoroki was still leaning heavily on one of the other students. His breathing was uneven. Izuku could tell by the small puffs of steam his breath turned into once it hit the air. He had his right foot placed a little forward. Ice coated his leg almost up to his knee, and ice shards were spread out. The ice traveled down the stairs, across the open clearing and straight over to All Might. It froze Numu, enough so the creature couldn't move. Izuku heard Shigaraki shout again, but he was more focused on trying to figure out what exactly Todoroki's quirk strength was. He was fairly sure that he did substantial damage to him, at least enough that most people would have either collapsed or passed out. It was probably a training difference. He caught himself getting off track, again, when he should be worrying. All Might had gotten free of Numu's grip and the portals vanished as the creature stood up again. Izuku frowned up at the students on the top of stairs again, though they couldn't see it. To Izuku, it was not a surprise when All Might completely blasted Numu out of the USJ building. Shigaraki screamed something about cheats. Izuku fought the urge to tell him to shut up. All Might had to be weak, he thought. The hero stood in a cloud of white smoke, but Izuku had an idea that it wasn't just smoke from the fight. Sensei had said that All Might would start smoking when he's running out of energy. Kurogiri seemed to notice it, too. If we attack him at once, we should be able to take him, Kurogiri said. Shigaraki hummed something, scratching at his neck. The gray-haired villain nodded quickly then. Izuku ran forward with Shigaraki, armbands turned off. He knew that since Ingenium Jr. was gone, he likely contacted other pro-heroes back at UA. They'd likely be here shortly. He wasn't going to attack with Shigaraki, exactly, more like make so he didn't get killed. Kurogiri was behind them, just floating across the ground. There was a small, high-pitched whistle. Izuku grabbed Shigaraki by his upper arm suddenly, skidding to a stop and pulling his extended, deadly hand back. The gray-haired man tensed up, ready to kill Izuku in a matter of seconds. A bullet grazing his hand interrupted him. Izuku and him both looked up at the stairs. Just like Izuku thought, there was a gathering of pro-heroes. He named two off the top of his head mentally, Smintas and Midnight. He recognized most of them, all dangerous and bad news if Kurogiri, Shigaraki, or him went up against them all at once. Kurogiri calmed Shigaraki down, as he focused on teleporting them out of there. Izuku breathed heavily, staring up at the heroes and students. He felt a pang of regret that it wasn't him stand up there with them, wearing a hero's costume. He turned back to All Might and blinked at him as everything seemed to move in slow motion. Pro-heroes were descending the stairs quickly, issuing orders and checking on students. Izuku found himself reaching into his jacket, pulling out the pistol he kept there. It was a plain one, something that was fairly easy to get and unmodified. He held it out at arm's length, pointing right between All Might's eyes despite the shakiness of his hand. Why was he shaking? He really didn't know. His gloved finger curled around and pulled the trigger just before the mist swallowed him. They were all back in the bar in the blink of an eye. Katsuki couldn't believe what he just saw. The green-haired villain, who he fairly sure was Deku, just tried to shoot All Might. A stone barrier had stopped it, also blocking the number one hero from the view of the students, thanks to Smintas. He blinked in horror and as they were escorted out of USJ, he felt Todoroki looking at him. Police came and the injured were given attention. Teachers and students milled around, talking quietly about what happened. There were mostly just minor injuries, only Aizawa and 13 with major ones, but almost every student had some sort of injury. Katsuki had taken painkillers for the headache, and a few other students had parts of them wrapped in bandages. He honestly hadn't paid attention to what was happening to the others, too focused on sorting out what the hell just went down. Police asked students questions, but he had turned away from them with a growl. While Katsuki was sitting away from the others, quiet and thinking it all over, Todoroki walked over and sat down next to him. Neither understood why exactly he did, or why he particularly cared about the explosive blonde. But Todoroki found himself just sitting there, watching his feet and trying to think of what to say. Katsuki was hunched over, elbows placed on his knees as he wrung his fingers together. Small explosions sparked on his palms, almost like a nervous habit than preparation for a fight. Todoroki dug the toe of one of his boot into the ground a little, and drummed his fingers on the bench they were sitting on. If that's Deku. Katsuki started, muttering out his thoughts. Something went really wrong with him. Todoroki hummed, encouraging the blonde to continue. Damn it, Katsuki grumbled, clenching his hands into fist and pressing them to his fist, explosion stopping. This is messing with my head. If it is him, Todoroki started, slow and careful so he didn't set the blonde off into a fit of rage. And you knew him, then think about it. Would there be a reason for him to be a villain? Hell, Katsuki snapped, but caught himself. His mind went back to the sludge incident right after he started speaking. He dug the heels of his palms into his temples and groaned. After the incident was over and before Izuku was claimed missing, the green-haired boy never left his house. Katsuki had went over a few times, forced by his mom, but Izuku's mother just turned him away saying that the other boy wasn't feeling good, wasn't up to it today, whatever it was. He didn't know what happened, not a real idea besides he got scolded by a few heroes. That didn't seem like something that would stop Izuku, considering everything he's fought to stand strong with his ideas. Todoroki watched as Katsuki started grumbling to himself. He looked back at the other students, most sitting down now. Another person, probably a policeman, walked up and announced that they'd be taken back to the UA building shortly. Students stood up and started following him to the bus. Todoroki looked back at the blonde as he stood up. Katsuki didn't seem to have heard the officer. Hey, Todoroki said. Katsuki lowered his hands and raised an eyebrow at him, daring him to do something. Todoroki just kept his face blank and turned back to face where the others were walking. We're heading back to UA. Katsuki glanced around at the other students all moving before huffing and standing himself. Todoroki started walking after he had made sure the blonde was following him, and walked after the other students. Katsuki grumbled, cursed under his breath and crossed his arms. There were too many blanks in the story he was putting together in his mind. Izuku lazily swirled the straw in his drink. He was sitting at one of the tables in the dimly lit bar. Shigaraki was playing a handheld game across from him and Kurogiri was cleaning a glass behind the counter. He had headphones over his ears, the wire leading to a laptop in front of him he was able to buy with the league's funds. The small device he normally had hooked over his ear in combat had taken excellent video of the USJ attack. Along with a few other cameras he put around the place, he had a reference video of every single student's quirk. His pen scratching across his notebook paper, and the quiet beeping and music of Shigaraki's game were the only noises in the bar. As soon as they had come back to the bar, Izuku had jammed his stuff in the duffel bag he used often and marched out of the bar with a short, brief, later. Shigaraki had seemed in a similar mood, if him throwing a bar stool at the wall was anything to go by. The piece of furniture had been half destroyed by the time it hit the wall. When Izuku walked in that day, laptop bag slung over his shoulders, Shigaraki had grumbled out an apology, but it didn't change the fact he nearly hit Izuku with the flying chair. Izuku took a sip from his drink and glanced down at his notebook. He was filling nearly 2 pages with notes on Todoroki Shoto. It was definitely an experience thing, he had noted when he went over the video the first time. Todoroki fought like he had been for a while, and had training to some extent. It was like Katsuki's instinctual fighting, more thought out or at least careful. He spun the pen along the back of his fingers and tapped the paper, where he just finished writing a small cluster of notes that was slanted despite the clear lines. Probably issues with father, would not use fireside, likely has one. About advanced training. Forceful. He paused the video, right after he had done the move to save All Might. A frown found its way on his face and he pursed his lips. Todoroki was obviously the most dangerous, but there were many good fighters in only Class 1A. He had to think about the other, and what kind of quirks they'd have. A half hour or so on the computer might have been enough for him to figure all that out, but he had to handle big threats first. Knocking his headphones so they rested around his neck, Izuku put down the pen and quickly sipped up the last of his drink, ice cubes clinking against the glass. He slid the cup away from him and rubbed his forehead, eyes closing. Most of his days were spent like this, sitting down at a table in the bar and going through information for the league.
And since yesterday was their big debut, he had a lot of media reports, internet rumors, and data to go through. He'd been sitting down in the bar almost all day, after dragging himself out of bed and grabbing a quick breakfast, going over footage of the battles over and over. It was maybe his fifth time going through them. That's what he thought at least, but he honestly stopped counting about halfway through the third time.
The computer screen that sat on the far corner of the bar counter flickered to life.
A shadowy figure appeared on the screen. Sensei was sitting in his chair, and it looked like the computer screen was the only light in the room. Izuku turned himself sideways, leaning on the back of his chair to see the screen. Shigaraki pretty much jumped to his feet and moved over to the bar, sitting on a stool closer to the screen. Kurogiri put the glass down and moved closer to the counter, a little behind where Shigaraki was sitting. As Sensei started talking, Izuku immediately recognized what he was going to say. Sensei gave speeches to Shigaraki in particular, and while Izuku could see why, it was a little annoying how often it happened. He learned to tune out that part, and then pay attention to what he needed to. So he turned his head back to look at the table and picked up his pen again, twirling it on his fingers again. Midoriya, Sensei's voice said after a few minutes of talking to Shigaraki. Izuku looked up and hummed his acknowledgement. I went over some of your footage, do you know Bakugo Katsuki? He seemed to know you. Izuku nodded briskly, feeling Kurogiri and Shigaraki's eyes on him. We went to school together before I ran away. He hated me, Izuku explained, clicking the pen. It's not an issue, and if it becomes one I can handle it. He couldn't see Sensei's facial express, he's not sure he's ever seen the man's face, but he could almost feel the dubious look he was getting. Izuku kept himself calm though, alternating between spinning and clicking the pen in his hands. Sensei hummed something that sounded like confirmation, and turned back to face Shigaraki at the counter. Well, we'll leave the analyses to Midoriya, Sensei said. Izuku half listened as Sensei went on and on about how they did a good job, that not all successes ended in wins, that the data they collected would be extremely useful, and that All Might was getting weaker. As their leader dismissed himself, Izuku nodded and Shigaraki hummed a word that sounded like goodbye. Kurogiri turned off the screen as Sensei turned off his own. Shigaraki turned to face Izuku and narrowed his eyes. The green-haired boy met his gaze head-on and didn't flinch. After seeing the gray-haired man lose his cool like a child so many times, his glares didn't do anything to threaten Izuku. He stood up from the stool and walked over to the table Izuku was sitting at. The other shifted back slightly, hand on the back of the chair twitching slightly. Shigaraki walked right up to him and took the pen out of his hand with 2 fingers. Don't mess up Sensei's plans with your stupid relationships, he growled, touching his other fingers to the pen and disintegrating it instantly. Izuku frowned and glanced at the pile of dust on the floor. Trust me, Bakugo Katsuki is more of a fiend than a friend, Izuku scoffed.
Shigaraki nodded slowly and walked back over to his own chair. Kurogiri seemed to relax that no one was hurt, and teleported Izuku's empty glass to the counter, emptying out the ice and putting it away. Izuku turned back to his laptop, moving his finger along the trackpad to shut out of his video play and shut it down. He stood up and slid his notebook into his computer bag. Shigaraki was back to his game, thumbs pressing the buttons quickly as he defeated some sort of digital monster. Izuku shut the laptop, and carefully placed it in his bag before walking towards the door. I'm going shopping, I'll finish my research at home, he excused. He stopped at the door and looked over his shoulder to glare at the back of Shigaraki's head. And you owe me a new pen, handy. Izuku took only a second to enjoy Shigaraki's flinch at the nickname before closing the door and strolling out onto the streets. He pulled up his hood as he went, hiding his hair again. When he passed the corner where his mother and Kachan usually passed out flyers, he couldn't help but note the blonde wasn't there. His mom kept trying to stop people, but it seemed most of the people who walked through that space had started to ignore her presence as a whole. He dug his teeth into his bottom lip to shut down any regret that wanted to make its way to the front of his mind. Izuku's home wasn't much. Just a small place that he could keep his clothes, books, and where he could sleep. He didn't consider it much either. It was one of the apartments in an old, and frankly ratty complex in one of the badder parts of the city. Being a villain, even one with a role as a, well, strategist was the best word for it, really. As Izuku closed the door behind him, he carefully placed his bag on the cheap pull-out couch he used for convenience. He probably hadn't had a full night's sleep in a couple weeks, and it was clear to see every time he looked in the mirror with the dark bags under his eyes. So, he let himself collapse face first into the slightly dirty mattress.
He didn't think that he had folded the bed back into a regular couch since he got it.
He forced himself to sit up and pull his laptop and notebook back out. He wasn't going to bother waiting for Shigaraki to get him a new pen, because the man had the mind of a toddler and would never do it. However, that was the third writing tool in the last few days, and the pack he had was running out a lot faster than he thought it would. He opened his laptop and powered it up. The screen lit up with an update notification that was unavoidable. Izuku sighed and clicked the start button and looked back up at the walls of his one-room apartment. The wallpaper was peeling a little, and had mystery stains that had been there since he moved in. He never bothered fixing any of it. Sticky notes, ripped out notebook papers, and sketches hung off the walls with scotch tape. Most of it was to organize his thoughts so he didn't get back into the habit of muttering. The sketches were doodles of heroes and how their quirks would affect nearby areas, diagrams more than anything. And the sticky notes were for anything else that came to mind. Quite a few having some variation of "why not me" crossed out with scribbles. A single poster was up, ripped unevenly with the tattered pieces on the ground. The hero's name was additionally crossed out in thick black marker, and a large, thick, red X on the smiling face. Izuku let out a slightly shaky breath, feelings climbing up in the back of his throat again. He closed his eyes to avoid looking at the poster that was too familiar, even in shreds. He really didn't know why he kept it. It wasn't like the poster fueled his undying rage. He would cringe at himself if that was the case. He looked back at the laptop and watched as the percent slowly clicked up. Grabbing the pack of pens that he kept in a small box under the mattress, he took another black pen out. He dropped the pack back to the ground and lied down across the mattress while he waited, spinning the pen in his fingers. He closed his eyes and tried to let his mind go blank. It didn't work, as per the norm, but it was enough to put him in a half-sleep. When Izuku woke up from his nap, it was late at night. His arms were sore from how he was lying down and the light from outside was almost completely gone. Just a moon and stars shining down. He groggily pushed himself up into a sitting position and rubbed his eyes. His stomach growled and he remembered that he completely forgot to go buy any food. He jumped up from the mattress, grabbed his wallet, phone, and changed into an old black sweater that was a little too big for him and old jeans. Definitely better not to go out in the clothes he wore when working for the League. They were sort of your classic modern villain clothes. Izuku practically pranced out of the apartment, locking the door behind him.
The 24-hour store was as rundown as the rest of that part of town. Izuku would have gone to a better place, but it was well past midnight and it was pretty close to his apartment. He looked over the shelves of cheap, bagged food. He grabbed 3 bags of chips and 1 bag of candy. He quickly paid of them and left the store. Once he left the building, he was opening one of the bags of chips and starting to eat. The street was near empty around this time of night. A few drunken stragglers from bars, night owls sitting at the few cafes that were still open, and people like Izuku, the ones with really messed up sleeping schedules. He ate the chips as he casually walked down the sidewalk. He probably seemed really out of place, a teen on the dark streets in a bad neighborhood. One of the stores he passed had TVs in the window, that were still on as the last employees inside finished closing up. Izuku paused in front of flat screens, momentarily watching the newscast. The media catches wind of everything, and pretty quickly, he thought, smirking a little. He wiped his greasy fingers off on his jeans before pulling his phone out and snapping a picture of the news. He half listened to the words the anchor was saying as he thumbed through his contacts, searching for the few that actually mattered.
UA students were supposedly attacked by a group of villains in their recent training at the Unforeseen Simulation Joint, or USJ, used to prepare the heroes in training for different natural disasters they might face. As far as we know, there were no substantial injuries on the half of the students, or pro-heroes who came to help. There's not much information on this story, and all we know for sure is that the villains did manage to escape, and that we do not know who or where they might be. Izuku selected Shigaraki's contact, which was rarely used unless it was business-related, and sent him the photo with the caption, "Look, we're famous." He didn't even considering waiting for a response and kept walking back towards his apartment, sliding his phone back into his pocket. He hummed to himself a little and kept eating. One attack and they already made the news. Days blurred together as they usually did. Izuku's sleeping schedule was practically non-existent as he began compiling more notes and strategies. The notebook papers on his walls were pulled off and replaced with new, relevant ones. He could barely walk across the room without stepping on a piece of paper, or 5, by the time he was done reorganizing it all. The wall with the lone poster was avoided and ignored as he practically drowned himself in the math and reasoning of it all. He was practically running on coffee and fast food that he grabbed on the few times he left the apartment. He knew it wasn't healthy, but he had a job to do. Izuku was almost falling asleep mid-note when his phone startled him awake. The persistent ringing seemed to echo in the silent room. He squawked as he shot up straight and accidentally broke the tip of his mechanical pencil. He grumbled as he leaned over to the side and picked up the phone. "Deku here," he greeted simply. He hadn't checked who it was, but he doubted anyone but the League would really risk calling him on one of his non-informant days. "Deku, how are you?" Kurogiri's voice replied from the other line. Izuku thought he heard the faint noise of Shigaraki saying stuff in the background, but ignored it. He smirked a little, leaning against the arm of the couch bed and stretching his legs out.
"Fine, and you?" Izuku asked. Kurogiri was always strangely polite for a villain, but he appreciated the civility compared to Shigaraki.
"I'm doing alright, thank you for asking," Kurogiri said. "We just received a message from Sensei, and we're wondering if you knew that you were supposed to go and watch the sports festival."
Izuku hummed and tilted his head backwards so it was upside down to look behind him. He thought he had written something like that down. Sure enough, on bright yellow construction paper hanging off the wall and written in black marker was, "UA Sports Festival."
"Yes, I am," Izuku answered with a nod Kurogiri couldn't see. "And as far as I know, I'll be on my own. Has anything changed?"
"No, but Shigaraki seems a little upset that you'll be going instead of him," Kurogiri said, ending in a sigh as the mentioned man shouted something.
"To be completely frank, I'm the only one who can blend in right now," Izuku snickered. His mind conjured up the image of Shigaraki trying to blend in with the usual crowd that attended the festival. It may or may not include the gray-haired man with a semi-ridiculous disguise. Kurogiri hummed his agreement. Tell him to stop being such a baby and realize it's just logical. Faint conversation on the other line before a loud clang. And tell him if he won't buy me new pens directly, that he should at least give me money for them. Sorry, not sorry to end this conversation early, but I am busy, so bye.
One more thing, Kurogiri said quickly, just before Izuku could hang up. Will you be stopping by the bar before the festival tomorrow, or just heading straight there? Unless Shigaraki has the pens he owes me, I'll just be heading straight there, okay? Izuku sighed, slouching down a little further on the couch. Very well, Kurogiri said. Izuku could easily tell that he had something else to say, but probably didn't want to sound rude. Have a good night, Deku. Thanks. You, too, Izuku replied. As the phone call ended, a loud yawn forced its way out of his mouth. He checked the time on his phone and groaned. It was nearly 10 at night. He dropped the phone next to him and rubbed his eyes roughly. Looking back at the note sheets hanging on the walls, he decided that he had done enough for a while.
Izuku reached over to the lamp that lit up the apartment on the coffee table. The overhead light had been broken long before he moved in. He flicked it off and grabbed the blanket that was clumped at the edge of the mattress. He pulled it up and wrapped himself in it, curling up on the couch bed and letting himself sleep until his alarm went off. The dreams were fragments, as they normally were when he fell asleep on purpose. Flashes of imagery, of memories and thoughts that were mostly forgotten. Any actual speech was clear, but cut off before it could really finish. Most faces were blurred, but some were clear like they were in high definition.
He wouldn't say that they were nightmares, or really scary in any way. Maybe haunting was a better word, as the pictures and fragments usually stayed with him throughout the following day. Still, he didn't dwell on it too much, because then the images would become clearer and words more defined. And there was a reason he preferred to keep those moments in the dreams or in the darkest corners of his mind that almost never surfaced.
The sun was too bright, and the crowd too pushy and loud as it was every year. Izuku never actually had been to the sports festival himself, but had seen it countless times on television as a child and loved it as a whole. Whole being the screaming, the showing of quirks, loud fans which he felt he could relate, and the overall buzz of excitement in the air. Now, as he was weaving his way through the crowd that he had always wanted to be a part of and got an elbow to the gut for the 5th time, he was starting to get a little irritated. Izuku had taken out the cheap black hair dye yet again. He rarely bothered applying it all the way through, just putting it on his hair enough so that it was a darker shade of green, near black but not quite. He hadn't even tried to hide the dark bags under his eyes, knowing that not many people would pay attention to one kid in a crowd of pro heroes. He had on a black long-sleeved shirt and dark jeans with stains that were probably blood that wasn't his. His tattered old messenger bag was slung over his shoulder, 3 different notebooks and a fresh pack of pens inside. He had his phone in his hand, sending a message to Kurogiri, knowing that Shigaraki never answered, and never would, and skimming some of the news sites. As always, nearly every single eye in the media was focused on UA's sport festival. Even other hero academies were watching the odd that all civilians did. He really didn't get it anymore. The seats all filled quickly, leaving Izuku without one. He didn't really mind, and hadn't planned on sitting down anyways. A lot of fans stood against the railing, completely ignoring the stadium seats behind them, to scream and cheer on the students. Izuku managed to find himself with a decent spot in front of the crowd, since he was still sort of on the short side and people could easily see over his head. He leaned against the railing casually, notebook open and pen ready in his hands already. He spun the pen leisurely as the rowdy fans pushed and moved behind him, everyone slowly getting settled before the first event began. An older man, on the heavy side, pushed up next to him. Izuku subtly shifted away. The man was far too sweaty and too close for his liking. He expected stuff like this, but still. Even before it all began, Izuku started jotting down initial notes and names. The crowds were finally starting to get settled, and the festival was going to begin in moments. The man next to him glanced over, probably hearing the scritch of Izuku's pen. He grinned a little at Izuku, and the green-haired boy glanced up, raising an eyebrow. "You a fan, kid?" he asked, and Izuku swore he could smell the grease of fries on his breath, but ignored it best he could. Izuku snorted, smiling faintly as the announcer said that the festival would begin in a minute. He glanced around the stadium, seeing the costumes of multiple pro heroes and sloppily made replicas belonging to fans.
"I guess you could call it that." The man laughed, like he thought it all was a joke, or some repressed fanboy trying to hide his nature. Izuku just shifted forward and away from the man a little more, and another hero fanatic managed to squeeze between them. The minute ticked away, and then the festival really began.
Students flooded onto the field, the cheers got even louder. Izuku watched them all move pointedly. Not only was Class 1A there, but every other student in UA. He recognized a few faces, but doubted any of them could recognize him. Except maybe. A pair of red eyes looked over his part of the crowd. He grinned smugly as the owner immediately stared at him. He raised the hand holding the pen and curled his fingers in a small wave. The blonde tensed up and frowned sharply, something foreign flashing in his eyes before he turned to where a pro hero was announcing the first event and beginning of the festival. Kachan. Katsuki was a ball of nerves the entire games.
He lashed out more viciously at every slight provocation and growled when people said anything about it. Other students had already been trying to avoid him in the games, but they tried even harder after the first event. He had blasted through the race course, Todoroki with him nearly the entire time, and nearly hit a few people at point-blank range with the explosions. A few of the others in 1A tried telling him off about it, but he just growled at them and stalked away each time. He couldn't put it together and that put him in an even worse mood. He could believe that Deku was still around, sure. He'd also believe that Deku would get the sports festival one way or another. Whether he vanished off the face of the planet or not, he was still a hero nerd in Katsuki's eyes. One thing he wouldn't believe, though, was Deku dressing like that and looking like that in general. When Katsuki thought of Deku, he still had the image of an innocent-looking kid with some baby fat left behind, and the bright green curly hair. A weak kid that couldn't really even stand up for himself, with a whole general demeanor of dorkiness. The Deku in the crowd was pretty much the opposite. No more baby fat that Katsuki could see, in fact it looked like he hadn't had a full meal in months. His hair was darker, and he leaned on the railing with his pen and notebook so confidently, like he belonged there. His eyes were different, too, not like Katsuki could see them that much. But what he could see was a lot darker than before. The demeanor Deku had was the most drastic difference. Every time Katsuki glanced up at him, Deku seemed casual and confident. Not even a small remnant of the shy and nervous boy a few months before. Katsuki was able to semi-distract himself with the different events in the festival. He managed to get into the second event pretty well. The final battles were mostly a blur to him. Thoughts of why exactly Deku was there and what he was doing slowed him down. He beat the gravity girl, but didn't get much further. There were some mocking comments from other students, but he was instantly tuning them out at this point. As the winners were announced, Katsuki was much more silent and just glancing up at the crowd every few seconds. He couldn't figure out why and it pissed him off even more. He was practically fidgeting by the time they were dismissed from the stadium and the festival declared over. Once it was over, most of the students were talking with people with connections to pro-hero organizations. Katsuki only hung around with that crowd for a little while. He didn't talk, but actually made a small effort to listen to them. It didn't last long, though. In the middle of whatever the person who was trying to talk to him was saying, Katsuki caught a glimpse of dark green hair down the hallway. He stiffened instantly and stared at the corner where the person was. Deku walked around the corner, looking down at his phone. The green-haired boy seemed to notice someone was staring at him and looked up. His steps faltered and he swiftly turned on his heel and started walking the other way. Katsuki growled and immediately started after him, cutting off whatever the person talking to him was saying without a word of his own. Deku glanced over his shoulder and sped up his walking as he rounded the corner. Katsuki scowled and started running after him. He almost skidded around the corner as he ran after the other. Like hell, Deku would be getting away without a questioning. One of the others who had been near him while talking to the hero representatives shouted after him. He didn't pay attention though, weaving through the crowd of leaving fans as he chased after the green-haired boy. Deku was moving just as fast through the crowd, ducking and dodging while Katsuki mostly pushed people out of the way. Deku dashed around a corner smoothly and Katsuki lunged after him. The green-haired boy managed to jump out of the range of his grip and they both came to a stop. Katsuki scowled and Deku stared at him. He stood up straight and crossed his arms. Somehow the hall they were in was almost entirely empty. Very few people were around, and Katsuki only let himself think about that for a second. He was a lot more focused on the green-haired boy in front of him. Yo Kachan, Deku greeted simply, tapping his messenger bag with a few fingers as if nervous. What the hell, Deku? Katsuki growled. The green-haired boy raised an eyebrow and tilted his head to the side a little bit. Katsuki gritted his teeth again and dug his nails into his arms. Where have you been? Where did you go? What the hell have you been doing? Deku drummed his fingers on his bag again, looking up at nothing as if in thought. He hummed a little and shifted on his feet.
I've been doing things, he said carefully. I'd love to tell you more, but I'm afraid I can't.
Katsuki rushed forward again, grabbing Deku by the collar and slamming him into the wall. He glared at Deku angrily. The green-haired boy winced slightly, but kept his cool otherwise and watched Katsuki a little blankly.
Was that you with those villains? Katsuki growled quietly, right in Deku's face. The other just blinked slowly, face not changing. Up close, Katsuki could easily tell that Deku's eyes were darker with some kind of emotion that the blonde couldn't figure out. Why does it matter? Deku spat back. Suddenly care about my well-being, Kachan. That isn't like you. Katsuki tightened his grip on Deku's shirt and snarled. He was torn between either slamming the other into the wall or punching him as hard as possible. Both sounded like good options to get some information out of the other. Bakugo, are you seriously attacking the spectators now? The Gravity Girl's voice said. Katsuki turned and glared over his shoulder. He didn't get why the hell she felt that she could act bold around him after losing. She looked past him and at Deku. What are you doing? Deku smiled innocently at the girl before headbutting Katsuki. The blonde cursed loudly and stumbled back a little bit. He put a hand to his nose to wipe up some of the blood that started dripping from his nose. Deku shifted on his feet, unsteady for a moment as he rubbed his forehead. He recovered quicker than Katsuki and pushed off the wall. See you around, Kachan, he said, voice happy and cheery as if he hadn't given the other a bloody nose. He started walking down the hall and waved at the blonde as he went. Have fun at UA. Deku practically pranced around the corner, hands swinging by his sides. He didn't even glance back. Katsuki cursed again and turned to march back to where everyone else was. The Gravity Girl had been watching it all, and she stared at the blonde with a concerned expression. She moved towards him and tried to get a good look at his face. Katsuki knocked her hands out of the way and stomped past. She seemed flustered for a second before she frowned and tried stopping him again. Out of the way, Gravity Girl, he snapped. My name is Uraraka, she grumbled. Katsuki glared at her again as he pushed past again and into the crowd. He wiped his nose again before jamming his hands into his pockets. He really could figure anything else out besides the fact that Deku, Midoriya Izuku, was a villain, or at least had a connection with them. The one part that kept him from putting anything together was the question of why would hero nerd Deku change so drastically. How have you been, Midoriya? Just fine, Izuku replied almost instantly. Any particular reason you called now? You know that I can't really afford distractions with this stuff. I simply wanted to check up on the progress, Sensei said. It didn't even look like he moved on the screen and Izuku wondered if the video was frozen, but Sensei was always like that. Have you completed the version using Eraserhead's blood we got at USJ? Is it ready for testing? Izuku frowned a little and looked down at the pristine table he was sat at. The camera that Sensei was watching through was placed on top of a computer screen on the corner of the table farthest away from Izuku. The room as a whole was a lot cleaner than any other in the old building. The floors were cleaned frequently, tables wipes down every day to prevent any accidentally mixes, and the different vials of Izuku's experimental serums were all kept in a neat case against the wall. Every part was labeled. They really couldn't afford to mix up some of those concoctions. The table that Izuku was sitting at was in the middle of the room. Counters lined the edges of the room, a few sinks here and there. The storage case was placed as far away from the door as possible, in the opposite corner, in case Shigaraki lost his temper again and found his way into the lab. Like said, they could not afford to mix up the serums in the case. Not quite sure, Izuku said, looking over his notes and back at the beakers he had spread out on the table in front of him. Clear goggles were pulled over his eyes to protect himself from any splashback as he carefully poured one vial's contents into another to mix. But it could be tested, though I don't think we should use it on anyone we really care about. Of course, Sensei said with what seemed like a nod. How did the interaction with Stain go? Izuku carefully put the glass containers down before he snickered. He couldn't cover his mouth to stop the little stream of laughter. No way was he putting hands that had been near the stuff he was making near any part of his face. He ducked his head in an attempt to hide it, but failed. Sensei sighed. Not well? Shigaraki got stabbed in the shoulder. Izuku managed as he tried to calm down so he wouldn't knock anything down. He closed his eyes and took deep breaths to calm down. Got flat out called a kid, pretty much. I almost hit my head on the bar laughing. Sensei sighed again, sounding exasperated and tired. Izuku really couldn't blame him, but the situation that had happened at the bar was pretty hilarious.
What about you and Stain? Sensei asked, interrupting Izuku's chuckling. Kurogiri told me you got stopped by him outside the bar.
Izuku's amusement was completely shut down with that.
He frowned and looked over to the side. He didn't get why the other villain was so interested in him, especially with Kurogiri and Shigaraki in the room. Sure, it might have been weird for him to laugh at his comrade getting pinned down and called a kid, but who wouldn't enjoy seeing bratty Shigaraki taken down a notch? No one, that's who. Izuku zoned out as he remembered the conversation, replaying it in his head and staring at the edge of the table.
You look like a high school student. Why are you with a group of villains like that? Stain asked. Izuku looked up in shock, not expecting the other to still be hanging around. He kept eye contact, though, not even flinching at the taller male's threatening aura. What does it matter, really? Fact is that I am a part of their organization and you are not, Izuku responded casually, shrugging. But why? Stain asked again, taking a step forward. Izuku took a step back. Why what? He asked. You'll have to be more specific. Why would a kid join a group of villains? Why did you become a villain? Because I found that heroes were doing it all for money. Is that why you joined? Not at all. Then why did you ask? Why did you? Stain scowled at Izuku, fists clenching at his sides. He looked ready to punch Izuku, and the green-haired boy couldn't blame him. He knew he was being irritating, but that was the plan, usually was. Irritate them until they forget their first question. Izuku carefully ran a hand through some of his hair, entangling it gently. The older man opened his mouth to say something more, but Izuku interrupted him. You're not getting an answer out of me. Just so you know, he said calmly, enjoying the slight flinch of the killer. I'm not one to spill my life story because someone else asks. If you really want to know, you can try figuring it out yourself. Have a good night. With that, Izuku had turned around and left. Stain didn't say anything else, didn't have a chance to as Izuku vanished down the maze of alleyways. Nothing important, Izuku answered, finally. He asked questions and I didn't give him a straight answer. I doubt if I had it would have influenced his decision. Sensei was quiet for a while before he seemingly nodded again. Back to the serums, Sensei said, easily redirecting the conversation. Any idea of when you want to test the serum with Eraser's blood?
Any time is fine, Izuku replied. He picked the mixed vial up and held it up to the lamp on the table, watching the liquid bubble slightly and reflect the white light. It should work for at least a while. The idea is to make it so the effects are permanent, but it's essentially impossible to test that. Just an hour would be enough, really, but more the better.
Of course, Sensei agreed. How about tomorrow? I'm sure Kurogiri and Shigaraki should be able to find a few test subjects. Izuku grinned and placed the vial back in its holder before standing up. Sounds great, he said, carefully picking up the holder and placing it in one of the empty parts of the storage case. Thank you for all your hard work, Midoriya, Sensei said. I'll contact you all tomorrow night, then. We should have some kind of results by then, Izuku hummed. He closed the drawer and walked back over to the table, peeling off the plastic gloves and tossing them in the garbage. Have a good night, Sensei. The screen turned off after Sensei had given a curt goodbye. Izuku whistled some catchy tune he heard in the mall earlier that day as he kept cleaning up. After wiping down the table and shining a black light on it just in case, he threw the towel in a plastic box he wrote used on in red marker. He grabbed his bag from near the door and notebook. Sliding the book into the bag, he unlocked the door and stepped out into the little room between the lab and main hall, to keep the clean room as clean as possible. Izuku peeked out into the much dirtier hall of the old building before he actually walked out. He closed and locked the outside door. The old building was actually right next to the bar, just across the alley. He strolled down the hall and stairs. Opening the side door with his back, he practically skipped out into the alleyway and across it. He looked down the passage as he did, and the city street still lit up with early afternoon light. Oh yeah, he woke up at 3 this morning. He had almost forgot. His steps faltered and he stopped, a few feet away from the bar's door. High school students, wearing UA uniforms, were standing near the entrance to the alley. They weren't in the hero course. No way Izuku would miss them if they were, but either general education ones or ones interested in the tech side of hero work. The small group were chatting animatedly, gesturing and laughing with each other. Izuku felt like he might have seen some of their faces before, but that was expected considering how much footage he went over of UA a day. One of boys laughed especially loud, and patted someone on the back. The others started cackling with him. Izuku bit his bottom lip and felt a lump rise in his throat, stomach churning in knots. Half of him wanted to puke at the classic display of friendship, and the other just wanted